Welcome to our new episode.
The Golden Spike and the Invisible Men, the forgotten history of America's rail line. Imagine a moment that changed a nation forever. A single triumphant clang echoing across the rugged, newly tamed American West. It is May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. The sun beats down on a scene of chaotic celebration. Two powerful locomotives, the Union Pacific's number 119 and the Central Pacific's Jupiter, stand nose to nose on a freshly laid track. A breathless crowd of dignitaries, engineers, and newspaper correspondents watches as Leland Stanford, the wealthy president of the Central Pacific, raises a silver-headed sledgehammer. He is about to strike the legendary Golden Spike, symbolically uniting the East and West with the first Transcontinental Railroad. The telegraph office hums, ready to broadcast a single word, "Done," to the entire country. This railroad is more than a line of steel. It is the physical manifestation of America's manifest destiny, the artery that shrinks the continent and opens the floodgates to prosperity. But look closer at the historic photograph taken moments before the strike. See the self-satisfied smiles of the railroad barons. Notice the celebratory posture of the Irish and German laborers of the Union Pacific. Now, try to find the men who did the impossible, who blasted through mountains of solid granite, who overcame blizzards that buried their camps whole, and who laid the majority of the Central Pacific's track through the most treacherous terrain in the West. They are not there. Not a single Chinese worker, who composed up to 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce, at one point over 12,000 men, is visible in the official records of that pivotal day. They had done the most dangerous, back-breaking, and ingenious work, yet at the moment of triumph, they were rendered invisible. This is their story. It is a true American saga of astonishment, innovation, and an almost unbelievable fight for survival against the mountain, the weather, and a shockingly callous management. It is the story of the Chinese laborers who literally rebuilt the face of the American West. The problem of the Sierra Nevada. The initial challenge facing the Central Pacific Railroad, CPRR, was the Sierra Nevada mountains. This was not a gentle incline. It was a sheer, unforgiving wall of granite rising 7,000 feet, often blanketed in 40-foot snowdrifts for half the year. The rival Union Pacific, building west from Omaha, had comparatively easier terrain across the prairies, but the CPRR was immediately blocked by an obstacle considered by many to be unconquerable: the construction of the Summit Tunnel near Donner Pass. The CPRR's chief engineer, Theodore Judah, Crazy Judah to his friends, was a man of vision, but his first crews were failing. These were mostly Irish immigrants, hard-drinking, hot-tempered men accustomed to rough manual labor. They took one look at the solid rock face, the abysmal pay, about $35 a month with board, and the deadly conditions, and they simply quit. By 1864, the Central Pacific was facing collapse due to a crippling labor shortage. They had less than a mile of track laid. It was Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four financiers behind the CPRR, who made the radical solution. He was met with immediate vocal scorn. "They are too small. They are not strong enough. They cannot endure the cold. They are not accustomed to this type of labor." The foreman argued. Charles Crocker, a man of blunt determination, snapped back. "Did they not build the Great Wall of China? They will build our railroad." In January 1865, a small experimental crew of 50 Chinese men from the gold fields of California were hired. They were mainly men from the Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong. often called sojourners, men who came to the Gold Mountain, California, with the intention of earning wealth to send back to their families in China. They were smaller in stature than the average European immigrant, yes, but what they lacked in size, they possessed in discipline, meticulous organization, and a quiet, relentless tenacity that would soon shock their employers. Their first task was simple track laying. They quickly proved to be superior workers. Where the Irish crews worked in spurts, slowed by hard liquor and prone to fighting, the Chinese crews worked with metronomic consistency, following routines established by centuries of labor tradition in China. They were incredibly careful with their tools, a trait that saved the company money, and they worked from dawn to dusk with few complaints. Crucially, their health practices were astonishingly effective. While the European-American workers dragged foul, often contaminated local water, the Chinese workers insisted on drinking only boiled tea, a practice that, unknown to anyone at the time, sterilized the water and drastically reduced diseases like dysentery that killed thousands on the Union Pacific line. They also ate a diet of dried vegetables and rice supplemented by fish and local game, which was generally more balanced than the typical laborer's ration of salt pork and whiskey. In short, they were surviving where others were dying or quitting. Crocker saw his opportunity and pressed it. He began recruiting aggressively, first throughout California's Chinatowns, and then with the help of recruiters in the Pearl River Delta, directly from China. The number of Chinese workers soared, from a few hundred to 3,000, then 6,000, and finally over 12,000 men. Blasting the granite monster, the tunnels. The greatest feat of engineering and sheer human willpower was the construction of the 15 tunnels through the granite spine of the Sierra Nevada. The most formidable of these was the Summit Tunnel, a 1,659-foot nightmare at the top of Donner Pass. The rock was so hard it shattered steel drills. Progress slowed to a horrifying few inches a day. Crocker, desperate for speed, ordered a radical and incredibly dangerous approach, working from 4 faces simultaneously. This meant drilling from both ends, as normal, but also sinking a 125-foot shaft directly down into the middle of the mountain, creating 2 additional faces inside the tunnel itself. The problem? Every single piece of rock, every scoop of dirt, and every drill bit had to be hoisted back out of that narrow shaft by hand using ropes and human strength. The Chinese crews worked in 3 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The conditions were hellish. In winter, the Sierra Nevada received snowfall so deep it buried the entire camps. Workers lived in tunnels carved under the snow, sometimes having to tunnel through 30 feet of white powder just to reach the main tunnel entrance. The air inside the rock was thick with dust and the noxious fumes of black powder and later the more volatile nitroglycerin.
The use of explosives was where the Chinese workers truly distinguished themselves and invented a technique that astonished American engineers. Initially, they used black powder. To set the charges, a worker had to drill a hole up to 3 feet deep into the granite. The Chinese perfected a technique called single jacking and double jacking, rhythmically hitting a steel drill bit with a hammer, turning the bit slightly between each strike. Their precision and speed were unrivaled. But when Crocker introduced the volatile, unstable liquid explosive, nitroglycerin, the danger became unimaginable. Nitroglycerin was exponentially more powerful than black powder, but also prone to exploding if dropped, jarred, or exposed to temperature change. American foremen were often too terrified to use it. The Chinese workers, however, quickly became experts in its safe, effective handling. They mixed the nitro right on site, and, in a horrifying display of dedication, were often lowered in hand-woven wicker baskets down the sheer granite cliffs of Cape Horn to drill holes from the outside in. They would hang hundreds of feet in the air, drill a hole, pack the explosive, light the fuse, and then frantically signaled to be hauled up before the blast. Many did not make it. One historian estimated that for every 2 miles of track laid by the Central Pacific, one Chinese worker died. Exact figures were never kept, but the death toll from explosions, snow avalanches, rock falls, and simple exhaustion likely numbered in the thousands. When the summit tunnel was finally completed, it was largely due to the unrelenting, disciplined work of these men. Yet, even in the face of such lethal labor, they maintained their culture. Their teapots were always boiling, they observed traditional holidays. Their work contracts even stipulated that if a man died, his remains were to be returned to China, a promise the Central Pacific later honored, sending the bones of the deceased back across the Pacific. The Great Race and the 10 miles in a day. Once the Chinese crews broke free from the Sierra Nevadas chokehold, the work changed from drilling and blasting to a desperate mile-a-minute race across the flatlands of Nevada and Utah. The government land grants and bonds were based on mileage, turning the construction into an unprecedented financial competition between the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific, driven by its own ambition and the work of thousands of Irish track layers and former Civil War soldiers, boasted about its speed. But Crocker, betting heavily on his Chinese workforce, wanted to silence them all. On April 28, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, Crocker placed a $10,000 wager with Union Pacific's vice president, Thomas Durant, claiming his men could lay 10 miles of track in a single day. This feat was considered utterly impossible. The previous record, set by the Union Pacific, was 8.5 miles. To lay 10 miles required 25,800 wooden ties, 3,520 rails, each weighing 560 pounds, 28,160 spikes, and 14,080 bolts. It required the orchestration of an army. Crocker's team, entirely composed of Chinese laborers, was led by the legendary foreman, James Strobridge, and a small elite crew of 8 Irish track setters who guided the rails into place. The work began at 7 a.m. It was choreographed with military precision, honed through years of practice. The supply train. A locomotive pushed flat cars loaded with materials right up to the end of the line. The headers. 8 Chinese men, 2 per rail, wrestled the 560-pound iron rails from the cars and into position. The spikers. A crew followed, spiking the rails loosely to the ties. The bolters. Another crew secured the plates and bolts. The surfacing gang. A massive crew came last, leveling the track, tamping the ballast, and driving the spikes home. The speed was unbelievable. They laid over a mile in the first hour. By lunchtime, they had covered 6 miles. By 3 p.m., they had reached the 8.5-mile mark, beating the previous record. But the men were exhausted. The sun was scorching, and they were still short of the 10-mile goal. Crocker spurred them on with promises and shouts of encouragement. The work reached a fever pitch. At 7 p.m., exactly 12 hours after they started, the final 2 rails were laid. The record was set. 10 miles and 56 feet of track laid in one day. The Union Pacific men were stunned. They paid the $10,000 in silence. It was and remains a world record that demonstrated the unparalleled capability, coordination, and sheer endurance of the Chinese workforce. It was a victory not just for the Central Pacific, but for the invisible laborers who had been deemed too small to do the job. The silence and the erasure. The 10-mile record sealed the win for the Central Pacific. The two lines finally met on May 10, 1869. The great promise of the Transcontinental Railroad was fulfilled. The telegraph flashed the word "done" across the country. But the story of the Chinese workers did not end in celebration. It ended in silence. On that historic day at Promontory, when the cameras were aimed and the champagne was poured, the Chinese crews were systematically kept off-site. Some historians suggest they were strategically moved off-site to finish preparatory work elsewhere. Others argue it was a deliberate choice by the railroad barons, who preferred a narrative of white American ingenuity. Regardless of the exact reason, the result was a stark and stunning historical erasure. The official image of the Golden Spike ceremony shows only white faces: Stanford, Durant, Strobridge, and the Irish track layers. The Chinese men who blasted the tunnels, survived the winter, and set the 10-mile record were, for over a century, entirely absent from the narrative of the railroad's completion. They were the anonymous muscle, the essential, ingenious labor that made the project possible, yet they received neither credit nor respect in the historical moment. Their reward for this astonishing feat of construction was a swift, brutal turn of events. Once the railroad was complete, the thousands of Chinese workers were no longer needed. Many were immediately laid off. With no land and no political power, they migrated to the growing Chinatowns, where they faced increasing xenophobia and economic competition. The astonishing contribution they made to connecting the continent was followed just a few short years later by the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major law in U.S. history to prohibit immigration solely based on nationality. The nation had used their labor to achieve its greatest engineering goal, only to then legally reject and demonize the laborers themselves. It took over 150 years for this historical injustice to be formally acknowledged. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Labor finally inducted the Chinese railroad workers into its Hall of Honor. Only then did the story of the invisible men begin to be woven back into the tapestry of American history. The Transcontinental Railroad is a monument to American ambition, but it is also a monument to the forgotten, relentless tenacity of the Chinese laborers. When you look at the track cutting through the harsh Sierras, you are not seeing a triumph of machinery, but a testament to the thousands of men who were lowered over sheer cliffs in woven baskets, who endured snowdrifts taller than their houses, and who with hammers, drills, and nitroglycerin literally moved mountains to build a new America. Their story is not just history, it is the powerful, astonishing, and necessary truth hiding in the background of the iconic photograph.